Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shakespeare and Company. Can you all hear me at the back? Just give me a little wave. Yeah, okay. Kamila Shamsie's searing new novel, Home Fire, is a tale of conflicted loyalties. Loyalty to one's faith, to one's country, to one's community, and perhaps most importantly to one's family, whether living or dead. Drawing inspiration from the Antigone myth, making the novel feel simultaneously timeless and painfully timely, Home Fire is also an examination of contemporary Western society, how we talk about our neighbours, how we cheapen our politics, and how we raise, or sometimes fail to raise, our children. Above all else, though, Home Fire is a heartbreaking and important story of one family's tragedy, told with the powerful lucidity upon which Kamila Shamsie built her reputation as one of the most compelling novelists at work today. Kamila Shamsie is the author of 6 previous novels, In the City by the Sea, Cartography, Salt and Saffron, Broken Verses, Burnt Shadows and A God in Every Stone, 3 of which have received awards from Pakistan's Academy of Letters. In addition to Home Fire being longlisted for this year's Man Booker Prize, Kamila Shamsie's novels have been shortlisted for the Bailey's Prize, the Orange Prize for Fiction, the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction, the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature, and the John Llewellyn Rhys Prize. She's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and in 2013 was named a Granta Best of Young British Novelist. Pankaj Mishra called Kamila Shamsie a very rare and uniquely rewarding writer. The Washington Post said Home Fire blazes with the kind of annihilating devastation that transcends grief. And Peter Carey called it recommended reading for Prime Ministers and Presidents everywhere. Please join me in welcoming Kamila Shamsie to Shakespeare and Company. And we're going to begin tonight with a short reading from Kamila, so I'll hand over to you.
Well, thank you, Adam, and thank you to all of you for coming out this evening. It's always a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to read from the very beginning of the novel, which means I don't have to set anything up, except it's not instantly evident, but this is at Heathrow Airport. Isma was going to miss her flight. The ticket wouldn't be refunded because the airline took no responsibility for passengers who arrived at the airport 3 hours ahead of the departure time and were escorted to an interrogation room. She had expected the interrogation, but not the hours of waiting that would precede it, nor that it would feel so humiliating to have the contents of her suitcase inspected. She had made sure not to pack anything that would invite comment or questions. No Quran, no family pictures, no books on her area of academic interest. But even so, the officer took hold of every item of Isma's clothing and ran it between her thumb and fingers, not so much searching for hidden pockets as judging the quality of the material. Finally, she reached for the designer-labeled down jacket that Isma had folded over a chair back when she entered, and held it up, one hand pinching each shoulder. "This isn't yours," she said, and Isma was sure she didn't mean because it's at least a size too large, but rather, it's too nice for someone like you. "I used to work at a dry cleaning shop. The woman who brought this in said she didn't want it when we couldn't get rid of the stain." She pointed to the grease mark on the pocket. "Does the manager know you took it?" "I was the manager." "You were the manager of a dry cleaning shop, and now you're on your way to a PhD program in sociology in Amherst, Massachusetts." "Yes." "And how did that happen?" "My siblings and I were orphaned just after I finished uni. They were 12 years old, twins. I took the first job I could find. Now they've grown up, I can go back to my life." "You're going back to your life in Amherst, Massachusetts." "I meant the academic life." The woman dropped the jacket into the jumble of clothes and shoes and told Isma to wait. That had been a while ago. The plane would be boarding now. Isma looked over at the suitcase. She'd repacked when the woman left the room and spent the time since worrying if doing that without permission constituted an offence. Should she empty the clothes out into a haphazard pile, or would that make things even worse? She stood up, unzipped the suitcase and flipped it open so its contents were visible. A man entered the office carrying Isma's passport, laptop and phone. She allowed herself to hope, but he sat down, gestured for her to do the same, and placed a voice recorder between them. "Do you consider yourself British?" the man said. "I am British. But do you consider yourself British?" "I've lived here all my life." She meant there was no other country of which she could feel herself a part, but the words came out sounding evasive. The interrogation continued for nearly 2 hours. He wanted to know her thoughts on Shias, homosexuals, the Queen, democracy, the Great British Bake Off, the invasion of Iraq, Israel, suicide bombers, dating websites. After that early slip regarding her Britishness, she settled into the manner that she'd practiced, with Anika playing the role of the interrogating officer and Isma responding to her sister as though she was a customer of dubious political opinions whose business she didn't want to lose by voicing strenuously opposing views, but to whom she didn't see the need to lie either. When people talk about the enmity between Sunnis and Shias, it usually centers around some political imbalance of power, such as in Iraq or Syria. As a Brit, I don't distinguish between one Muslim and the other. Or, occupying other people's territory generally causes more problems than it solves. This served for both Iraq and Israel. Killing civilians is sinful. That's equally true if the manner of killing is a suicide bombing or aerial bombardments or drone strikes. There were long intervals of silence between each answer and the next question as the man clicked keys on the laptop, examining her browser history. He knew that she was interested in the marital status of an actor from a popular TV series, knew that wearing a hijab didn't stop her from buying expensive products to tame her frizzy hair, knew that she had searched for how to make small talk with Americans. "You know, you don't have to be so compliant about everything," Anika had said during the role-playing. Her sister, not quite 19, with her law student brain who knew everything about her rights and nothing about the fragility of her place in the world. "For instance," Anika had said, "if they ask you about the Queen, just say, 'As an Asian, I have to admire her colour palette.'" It's important to show at least a tiny bit of contempt for the process. Instead, Isma had responded, "I greatly admire Her Majesty's commitment to her role." But there had been comfort in hearing her sister's alternative answers in her head, her ha of triumph when the official asked a question she'd anticipated and that Isma has dismissed, such as the Great British Bake Off one. Well, if they didn't let her board this plane or anyone after this, she would go home to Anika, which is what half Isma's heart knew it should do in any case. How much of Anika's heart wanted this was a hard question to answer. She'd been so adamant that Isma not change her plans for America, and whether this was selflessness or a wish to be left alone was something that even Anika herself didn't seem to know. A tiny flicker in Isma's brain signalled a thought about her brother Pervez that was trying to surface before it was submerged by the strength of her refusal ever to think about him again. Eventually the door opened and the woman official walked back in. "Sorry about that," she said unconvincingly. "Just had to wait for America to wake up and confirm some details about your student visa. All checked out. Here." She handed a stiff rectangle of paper to Isma with an air of magnanimity. It was the boarding pass for the plane she'd already missed. Isma stood up, unsteady because of the pins and needles in her feet, which she'd been afraid to shake off in case she accidentally kicked the man across the desk from her. As she wheeled her luggage out, she thanked the woman whose thumbprints were on her underwear, not allowing even a shade of sarcasm to enter her voice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that in a way that was a very sort of representative extract of at least one element of the novel, or at least what reading Home Fire gave to me, was a realization of where we are as a society at the moment, whether a British society or I think similar things could be applied in France. So that exchange, do you consider yourself British? I am British, but do you consider yourself British? It seems like something which maybe 5-10 years ago we would have hoped would have been consigned to the 70s or the 80s in Britain. There seems to have been a sort of resurgence in this kind of questioning and this kind of treatment of British citizens. Was part of the motivation for writing the novel to expose these these kind of aggressions?
Well, as a novelist, I'm always interested in writing to explore rather than expose, because expose assumes that I already have all the information and now I want you to have it, which is not very interesting for me. I mean, if I'm going to spend a year or two of my life being obsessed by something, it can't possibly be something I know already. And also, really, I often find I may think I know something and then I start working on a novel about it, and that's when that becomes my way of knowing. So it was, I think, a way of exploring things. And partly, I became a British citizen in 2013. So I was, I'm relatively new to that whole idea. And, it's fine because I'm quite comfortable with the fact that I'm recently become this thing. And so if someone says, well, what does that actually mean to you? I don't know exactly what that means to me. But when the questions are put to someone who has been born in Britain and grown up there, that becomes a different thing. And that's why, to me, one of the striking things in the way these things happen and the way that interrogation scene is set where it is, because Usman's flying to America, so I had 2 airports, and I could have had the interrogation either place, and personally I've never had any issues coming in and out of Britain, and I've often been in the secondary examination room in America, so in some way I know what those rooms look like, but I wanted it to be this thing where this is her own homeland. She's trying, and she's leaving her home, and she has no criminal conviction. She's never done anything, and in her own homeland she's being put through this, because of course it is an old story to have it when you're trying to enter other places and they don't know who you are.
I'd like to come back a little bit later to talk specifically about what issues of contemporary society are explored in the book, but since you used the word explore and you decided to spend, as you say, several years with these sort of issues, I'd like to talk a little bit about the genesis of the book. What was the sort of the seed that caught your attention as a writer when you started working on the novel?
So seeds are funny things, because generally a novel, being a rather large and expansive form, has several seeds. The most obvious one was there's a theatre director, a man who runs a theatre in London called Jatinder Verma. It's a Tara Arts Theatre. I didn't know him. He called me in for a cup of coffee one day and he said, I really like your novels. I like the way you do dialogue. I think you should write a play for me. And I said, but I don't know how to write a play. And he said, I thought you'd say that, so why don't you adapt something? He said, the Greeks are particularly speaking to us these days. Why don't you look at a Greek play, something like Antigone, and try and do see if there's a contemporary retelling? And I said, all right. And I'm sitting and thinking, which one was Antigone? I don't remember. I hadn't looked at it since I was at university. So I went, and I'm ashamed to say that I did actually, on the tube home, I went to Wikipedia and looked up the plot summary of Antigone to remember what it was, and then went home. But actually, one thing that happened was, almost as soon as I looked at the plot summary, I knew what the contemporary story was, which was what told me that actually there was a seed already there. And partly that seed had to do with the fact that because I had just become a citizen, because this conversation with Jatinder was in 2014, and I, as I said, had become a citizen in October 2013. And so I was paying particular attention to citizenship laws and things around that. And one thing that was happening was, around that point, 2014, was when you have in Raqqa, Islamic State declaring their so-called caliphate, and all these young Brits going. And this conversation started about stripping people of citizenship. And that really sort of struck me. And so that was in the back of my head as well. This idea that if you're a dual citizen or if you're naturalized, then your citizenship is contingent. And Theresa May was then Home Secretary and wanted to expand that, to everyone, sort of thing, and wasn't really able to do that. So that was part of it, that idea of what does it mean to be a citizen of a place? Is it some, can you be divorced? Who has the right to divorce? Is it you or is it the state? Or are you, once you are of each other, whatever you do, the state may imprison you, the state may treat you terribly, but the state can't say that you are not one of them. So I was sort of interested in all these ideas. And at the end of it, I'm also always interested in what happens when history stomps its boots into families' lives.
I was wondering concerning the choice of Antigone, because obviously, as you read the book, like, all of the main characters are either Asian or of mixed heritage, which we'll talk a little bit about more in a moment. But I did wonder about the use of sort of, let's say, one of the sort of the founding myths of European culture to sort of in a story with largely characters of Asian heritage. Was that something which you sort of appreciated as you're writing it? What did you find any kind of cultural tension between?
No, because I grew up in Karachi loving the Greeks. So that was one of my favorite things. And my actually previous novel, A God in Every Stone Touches, and all this, one of my favorite things in the world is in Pakistan, in the excavated city of Taxila, there are these Buddhist stupas. They're sort of beautiful things, and they're about 2,500 years old, and they're mini stupas, and you have the figure of the Buddha across the upper levels, and at the bottom level there is Atlas holding up the Buddha. And that's very near Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan. The Greeks, of course, were in the subcontinent, and then the Indo-Greeks. So you had, all these sort of Ptolemy of the Punjab and all of that. And if you look at Gandhara art, which is my favorite form, the Greeks are very much in there. So actually, the Greeks have come through, and also in around the Middle Ages, when Europe possibly wasn't having its greatest moment, a lot of the Greeks were being kept alive in translation by the Moors and by Arabs, and so there is actually it is a very intertwined history, and in my life it's always been an intertwined history. My grandfather grew up in what was British India. It was, he must have been about in his around 30 when partition happened, and he went to Oxford to study the classics. So when I grew up with my grandfather, who loved Greek more than anything else, would at the dining table quote onomatopoeias from Greek to me when I was 4 years old, and say, this is the greatest onomatopoeia ever, and it's Aeneid, and all of that. And so that was just my life.
Because it's funny, because I was playing a little bit devil's advocate there, just because that thought occurred to me, and then I realised actually that's a sort of a similar thing that we do when we talk about the problems with ISIS at the moment, or with Islamic terrorism, is we kind of say this is a problem which is coming external to Europe, external to the West, rather than considering it as something which could maybe be produced, be a product of Western civilization. And equally, on the subject of citizenship, it seems that this urge to strip people of dual nationality, of their British citizenship or of their French citizenship, which was proposed, was another way of sort of saying, this is not our problem. This is not coming from our culture, from our background. This is something external. I mean, was that something that that you wanted to address?
I certainly want to address the fact that all all the characters in my novel are born in Britain and raised there. But of course, you can be dual national. I have plenty of friends who, let's say, are Pakistani or various actually backgrounds, and they've grown up, they've married and lived in Britain, they're British, they may be married to an Englishman, they have kids, and they're saying, we want our kids to be able to go back to Pakistan to visit the grandparents. The easiest way is to get them a Pakistani passport as well, because then we don't have to apply for visas all the time and all of that. So it becomes purely a sort of a thing that's about family, really. We need them to visit granny in the easiest way. So you get them a second passport, not realizing at the moment you do that, you make it possible for the British government to say they're not ours, right? Which is an absurdity.
It's interesting because, of course, the story is fundamentally a family story. I mean, the myth of Antigone, and I'm not quite sure how much we should talk about it, because I'll confess not really knowing the myth, and sort of while reading Home Fire, holding off finding out too much about it. so as not to spoil it or to sort of reveal any twists. So I'm not sure how much we should necessarily tell our audience, but maybe would you be able to just set up a little bit the characters we're going to meet in Home Fire, the family and a few of the people they're come into contact with?
Yeah, and I'll say this about Antigone. My hope with the novel was that anyone who didn't know Antigone, you wouldn't even think that there's something other than this book that you need to be aware of in terms of literature. But that those people who did know Antigone, rather than feeling, oh, I'm so bored now, I know everything that's going to happen, would still find a sort of interest and excitement in the way it veers off from or uses that. So if you know Antigone, that's fine. If you don't, it's fine. That's my little sales pitch here. But the 5 characters in the novel, and again, those of you who do know Antigone will recognize where they come from. There are 3 siblings who... The 2 sisters and a brother. Isma is one of them, who we've met already. She's the older sibling. And she has twin younger siblings who she's essentially raised since their mother died when the twins were 12 years old and she was 21. Their father was absent all their lives. And so she's raised them. So she's very much the sort of conscientious person who's really feels rightly that she sort of put her life on hold to raise these children, and now is getting a chance to go to America and start in a way. And then there are the twins. So there's Anika, who is mentioned there, who is starting to be a lawyer. A friend of mine said that possibly Anika and Isma are 2 ways of being a woman in the world, or 2 ways in which the world allows you to be a woman. And one is that you are quite dutiful, and you look after your family and you put your own needs to a side and you do all that. And the other way is to say, I want what I want. And this is what I'm going after. So in some way, those 2 sisters are those 2 kinds of things. And then there's their brother, Pervez, who was always sort of, in some way, the runt of the litter. He's very much the sort of quietest of the siblings. But he's also the one, as the only boy, who really misses his father. And the thing about the father, I think we can say this much we won't be too spoilery, but his father, who they never knew, really abandoned his family to go off and fight jihad in many different countries. So it started with Bosnia, and then he moves on to Chechnya and Afghanistan and Kashmir and all over the place, and then he ends up in Afghanistan in 2001 and is captured by the Americans and dies on his way to Guantanamo. And that's what the family knows about him. And this young boy, Pervez, has grown up without a father and without a male role model, and has all kinds of vulnerabilities around that question which get exploited. So that's one family, the 3 of them. And the other family is a father and son who come from a very different kind of world. The father is a man called Karamat Loan, who is one of the most powerful politicians in Britain. He's the Home Secretary. Again, from a Muslim background, but he's sort of risen politically and in class terms in all kinds of ways, and has largely sort of shut himself off from his family and background. And then there's his son Ayman, who has one parent who's Pakistani British and one who's Irish American, and he's basically grown up a posh boy in London without very much to concern him about life, because he's very well off and very good looking and very charming and does well in the world.
And one thing readers will realize quite quickly is that your narrator's voice, you don't stay with just one of the characters. So we begin with Isma, then we go on to, I think, Anika afterwards.
We go to Ayman then Pervez, then Anika, then Karamat.
And I just thought it was an interesting approach. So we're with them and with their thoughts in a kind of close third person. Did you know from the beginning that you were going to adopt that approach, or was it something that grew naturally from maybe trying to tell all sides of the story?
I knew quite early on. There was a moment of about 3 seconds when I thought I might just tell it from Isma's point of view, and then very quickly realized that there was a lot she didn't know. And in a lot of ways, actually, what the book is about the fact that you can live in the same house as people, or you can be lovers with someone, or you can be someone's parent or someone's child, and in some ways you can know them really well, but there can be a bit of their life you don't know, or a bit that moves away from you. And it's that all the bits of unknowing, actually, that I was interested in, and the ways that you misinterpret something, or you misjudge something, or because you've known someone their whole life, you don't notice the moment they change, and they stop being that one kind of character, you know. And so very quickly I realized that was in some ways where the heart of the novel lies, is this mixture of the intimacy and the unknowing. And the way to do that, I thought, was to do the 5 characters, so you can see how they're all, well, they're not all seeing each other, but at least, you know, one of them is always seeing at least one or two of the others, and how their view of who the other person is and what they're thinking and what they're all about is sometimes absolutely on the nose, and then just at other points they're just missing it.
And I think what it also does is very effectively sort of neuters the reader's judgment of any particular character. So, for example, when we're first with Isma, you know, our opinion maybe of Karamat Loan is not particularly positive. But once then we start to get a view of him through his son and then through himself, there's a sense, whether it ends up positive or not, there's certainly an understanding which is fostered in the reader's mind, I thought.
I think it's very easy to think that you need to know 2 or 3 things about a person in order to know what they're really about. And certainly I'm guilty of it. You know, particularly public figures, as Karamat Loan is, you think you know what they're all about, and you don't necessarily. Of course, with public figures, you don't need to know. I mean, I remember I was in New York a few weeks ago, and there was an article in the New York Times saying about, is Donald Trump himself personally racist? And I thought, actually, I don't care. You know, I care what the effects of his policies are. I care what the effects of what he's saying is. Whether he personally is or isn't is actually wholly irrelevant to my life and to the world.
And I think the characters, so for example, Pervez particularly, but I think all of them to a certain extent, one of the most striking things is that their problems are not particularly exceptional. So, for example, Pervez lacking a father figure, or Isma having to bring up her sister because her brother and sister because of their parents had passed away, and yet there's something about the way society treats these people because of their heritage, or because, as you mentioned, the background with their father, because of sort of their actions of their ancestors, that means that these normal problems manifest themselves in quite abnormal and quite destructive ways.
I think we're living in a very odd world now, where there's an element of surveillance that exists in people's lives now in liberal democracies that to me is very familiar from growing up in Pakistan in a time of military dictatorship. You know, when I was growing up as a child and you picked up the phone and you knew, even as a 7 or 8 year old, I knew there were certain things you didn't say on the phone because it could be tapped and someone could be listening in and all that kind of stuff. And what, you know, even though you're right that in some ways what the issues they have aren't exceptional, but because they have because they're Muslim, and B, because in their particular case, actually their father really was incredibly dodgy, they spend their whole lives with the sense of, we are being watched, we are being judged, we have to be very careful what we say. At any moment, we are assumed guilty, and we have to therefore prove ourselves innocent. Isma particularly feels that very strongly, and whereas Anika's response, you know, is to just say, I'm sort of going to ignore it, I'll say what I say, and, you know, and so she's on texting her sister and, you know, decides that MI5 is listening, and so is texting them to say, go and arrest some bankers, stop spying on us. You know, that's her way of dealing with it.
And in the case of Pervez, I think as well, the lack of a father figure, it's something. It's very interesting that you explore the dynamic, and that at least in his case, is a sort of a motivating factor, drawing him to people who are sort of associated with extremism. And it made me think of something the actor Riz Ahmed had said. I don't think it was his Emmy speech, but I think it was a few months before, when he said, you know, the problem is everyone thinks they're the good guy. You know, everyone is sort of dealing with their own situation, and everyone thinks, I think he said, everyone thinks they're James Bond in their own particular situation. And if we want to understand these young men who are drawn to extremist activity, it doesn't we shouldn't think of it as necessarily an alien philosophy or a mechanic which we don't understand because we've never read the Quran, for example. But we need to look at sort of how, I guess in a way, we have to empathize with these boys in a way that we kind of understand.
I mean, I don't think it's necessary to empathize with everyone on the planet. Let me start off by saying that. There are certain people with whom I don't empathize. They cause incredible destruction, and my feeling is something unprintable and unrepeatable. But one of the things that was interesting to me when I was researching this book was I did start thinking about how young so many of these British men, I mean there's some women as well, but it's mainly men who get drawn into certain kinds of radicalization. And you think sort of 15, 16, 17, 18 to sort of, at that age to say, I have no interest in you, you have my empathy isn't with you. That's too young. What is going on with all of them? And one of the things that really interested me, because at first I actually didn't think I was going to have Pervez's story in here. I thought it would be the other four and he would just be a figure. But what interested me was I started to look at people who had done research on the recruitment materials of Islamic State. And my assumption going in, based on just what I'd been reading in the newspapers and everywhere, is that what they use to draw people in is violence. And that they're drawing in these young men who are bloodthirsty, to whom violence appeals, who would like the idea of having a gun in their hand and feeling powerful by going and killing someone, which is such a screen-crawling kind of thing. I didn't particularly want to be in the head of that person. And then when you actually look at the work that's done, there's a man called Charlie Winter, who's a researcher, who looked at 3 months of propaganda that was specifically, to try and get these young people to come. And he said there's violence in there, but it's a much smaller percentage than you would imagine. And actually the main things in there are things like a sense of belonging, nation building, lack of racism, a welfare state. They have lots of... And then I looked at some of the pictures. They're very beautiful. They're very skillfully produced. And they're pictures of, very beautiful young men sitting together with their arms around each other looking happy. And an old man plucking grapes from a vineyard. And here's this utopia. Come here, have this life. And there are zoos and we do animal conservation. Literally, I'm not making this up. Right? This is part of the whole propaganda. And I thought, so it's actually their propaganda is much more sophisticated than we think it is. We need to be sophisticated about understanding what they're doing to try and draw people in. Otherwise, it's really game over if we're not looking at what they're doing. And so much of it was around sort of belonging and things like that. And I thought, lost boys. I mean, that was actually the phrase that came up. Oh, lost boys, you're finding a way to target them and turn them. And, which is not to say they aren't responsible. And it's not to say that our response, if and when they do awful things, is to first think of them. But there are plenty of people. I mean, the difference between Islamic State and a lot of groups like Al-Qaeda and all that is Islamic State was actually trying to set up a state, which meant that they didn't just want fighters, they wanted doctors, they wanted engineers, they wanted media people, they wanted, so they had this very sort of wide-ranging way of getting people, and we weren't talking about it. Because there's almost a sense that if you're talking about it, then you're empathizing, then you're justifying. That's a very scary line, that if you dare look at it too closely and say, actually, this is complex, then you're saying it's fine, or you're justifying the whole thing. So I think there's been a real sort of shortfall in the conversation around how did they get people to come across. And
I think that's one of the things that you do quite often in the novel, and again very effectively, is that sort of bringing, I think, the reader up against their own not necessarily prejudices, but certain assumptions. So there is that moment when Farouk, who's kind of the recruiter for Islamic State, who's perhaps one of the people who does atrocious things that you talked about earlier, but he gives this kind of spiel about how Britain used to be.
Yeah.
And he said, this used to be a great country. We used to be a welfare state. It used to be welcoming to migrants, and using a lot of terminology which you find yourself, I think, as a broadly liberal, perhaps left-wing reader, sort of broadly identifying with. Yeah. And it also makes me think about the propaganda, about the use of media, and I think media from both sides is a very important element in this book. Both, obviously, the ISIS propaganda, which you've talked about, but also the way the British media talks about and doesn't talk to British Muslims, I think. And at a certain moment, you actually use articles. And I was just wondering, I thought that was an interesting stylistic choice, and why you thought it was necessary to actually sort of break from the narrative to include
Well, one
these
thing
articles.
was, because I did start with Antigone, and it was sort of fun to think about when there were things you could use from the play, and when there were things you would discard. And one of the things I thought was, so the Greek chorus, what's the Greek chorus today? And I thought, media and social media is, because the Greek chorus within the play, it's sort of, it very much is, it's impressed by the strong man, but then it's also moved by the pitiful woman. Then it's kind of moving, back and forth. It has this view, but it has that view, but it's quite, also very emphatic a lot of times. And I thought, it's like being on Twitter, really, listening to the Greek chorus. And I thought that actually I did. And I also wanted this disconnect, because in the novel you have people who are going through what are essentially family tragedies, and it's the most personal things that are happening to them, of loss and devastation and love and hope and all these kinds of things. And yet, because it comes to involve public figures and public events, these become public spectacles, and people who don't know very much about them basically are taking their lives and making them news and making them tweets and making them all kinds of things in a way that just is so discordant. And I wanted that discordancy of, actually, this is what it is to live this life, to live this moment and this grief and this turmoil, and then this is what it looks like amplified, and that's how we're getting it. Right, we, general public, this person's grief here is going to come to us via this strange amplification, perversion, reduction method. And then however empathetic we might be, and however much we must be thinking, that's terrible, we can see there's some stereotyping going on in there, but we don't know how to get from there back. Back to the source, because the last thing they want to do at that point is to talk to anyone, because the public, the sound of it is so awful. And one thing that struck me, when I was writing this book, I was very lucky that one of my closest friends, who's the writer Gillian Slover, who's wonderful, had been commissioned by the National Theatre to write a verbatim play which was ultimately called Another World, How We Lost Our Children to Islamic State, which is, very much looking at these kind of issues. And the one thing she found, that she couldn't find in Britain any family members of young men and women who'd gone to some extent, who would talk to her. I mean, she found people who knew them, sort of lawyers and the like, and they just said they're so scared off by the way they get represented and misrepresented that they will not speak to anyone. She couldn't find one. And she ended up going to Brussels, where there were sort of support groups, and there were all these mothers and a few fathers together whose families had gone off, whose children had gone off, and they were all in the state of utter devastation, but they had each other. And in Britain there was nothing. There was just this sort of solitary shame and quiet. And I thought, but then how are we getting these stories then, if they're too afraid to speak or too traumatized to speak?
Do you think the lack of that in Britain could in some way be connected to the sort of the particular viciousness of the tabloid media compared to, I mean, certainly compared to the printed press in France? I mean, there's nothing like it. There's nothing that adopts the same tone. I mean, in the I did even wonder if sort of non-British readers or people who hadn't had experience with the British tabloids might read some of the extracts, but they're not going to use words like evil or sort of terribly kind of insulting, shameful words aimed towards women. Like, you wouldn't find that in a newspaper. Whereas, of course, having grown up in Britain, you know that you do find that, and you find that every day. Do you think that maybe one of the reasons she had to go to Brussels was...
I think it's partly that. I think also because of actually government programs of surveillance and the kind of things you're required to report. And I don't think we can let the state off the hook. So I think that's in there as well.
And it's also, of course, I mean, I focused on the tabloid media there, but there's also a moment where you talk about the certain terms which you find in the so-called quality press. So when when there is some event or someone is arrested or something like that, it will be sort of people described as not as British terrorists, but British of Pakistani descent or British Muslim or British passport holders. And so these terms which are in some way sort of almost more poisonous because they hide behind a sort of veneer of respectability and correctness. And it really sort of it highlighted to me again just how much our media and the discourse is so infiltrated by these kind of terms.
Yeah, I mean, one thing is, when you start a novel, I was once at a talk with the wonderful writer Hisham Matar, the Libyan writer, and someone was asking a question and said, so when you were writing this particular thing, what were you thinking, or did you think X? And Hisham said, when I'm writing, I try to think as little as possible. And everyone in the audience laughed, except all the writers there who knew exactly what he meant, which is of course you're writing, and it doesn't mean you're not thinking, but there's stuff that's at the back of your brain, and you don't even know you're doing it, or you're not thinking, in a kind of critical analysis way why you're doing it. And then, it's when the book comes out, and one of the things I sort of realized after the book came out and people talked is that what the book has in it is 5 characters. They're all British, they're all Muslim, and even the ones who've grown up in the same household, they have 5 very different kinds of experiences of that. So I didn't want to be reductive either and say this is the only way to do it, because it is also true that, on one hand we've had a period of increasing bigotry and tabloid hysteria. On the other hand, we have a Muslim mayor in London, which would not have happened 15 years ago, I don't think. And you have within the Tory party, when I started to write this book, actually, at that point, Sajid Javed, Saida Warsi and Sadiq Khan, you had 3 Muslim politicians who were all very prominent. And I thought, 3? That's extraordinary. It's also, for those of you who know London jokes, extraordinary that 3 of them are all the children of bus drivers. And so there's a joke about London buses, which is you wait forever for one and then 3 come along. And so it was with these 3 British Muslim politicians. But it was this interesting moment that, or you have someone like Zayn Malik who is Muslim and is increasingly sort of owning that in a way, but is this mega star. So it's actually a very interesting moment, and it's a moment of where there are all these different things going on at the same time. And one of the wonders of London for me, which is a city I sort of feel I decided to be there, I claimed it, I adopted it, and I hope it's adopted me, is you do find everyone there. And you find within that everyone all levels of experience. So there isn't the British Muslim experience. There are some commonalities. There are some things, so there's a phrase, there's a bit in the book where there's Anika meets the son of the Home Secretary, who doesn't think of himself as Muslim in any way. His father, was raised Muslim, but he's never had anything. And he's trying to sort of impress her. And he is trying to think of something interesting to say about her neighbourhood, which he really doesn't know because he's come there for the first time, because it's wrong side of the tracks sort of thing. And he says, there was a bomb there by the IRA, planted a bomb in this area, and if you sort of look it up on Google, just put in the words bomb and North Circular Avenue and IRA, and you'll get really interesting footage about it. And she says, yeah, that's a really good idea if you're GWM, isn't it? And he says, what's that? And she said, Googling while Muslim. So Googling while Muslim is an experience that I think most Muslims, unless you're the son of the Home Secretary of that particular variety, would probably recognize and understand the phrase. I've had so many of my Muslim friends write to me and say, did you invent that, or did we somehow not know that phrase until now? And I said, I like to think that now everyone will be using it. But actually, it is a very varied experience, and part of what I was interested in the book was actually to look at this London, at this city where all these different experiences actually are possible, but what then happens when they bang up against each other? What happens when the very privileged son of the Home Secretary falls in love with the woman whose father died on his way to Guantanamo? Right, what's going to happen there?
What indeed is going to happen. It's over to you guys now. I could go on picking Kamila's brains all evening, but if you have a question for her, just raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you so everyone can hear. Who would like to kick us off? Don't be shy. Was that no?
Always shy for the first question.
There we go. We'll just get the microphone to you so everyone can hear you.
I recently read Jihadi Jane, and maybe I'm basing this question on these two books, yours and his. So are such books becoming more popular, more written? Is it seen as some kind of answer to what is happening, or like another point of view? What is your impression?
I don't know. I mean, I haven't read Tabish's book yet, although I very much want to. I'm the kind of writer who finds it hard not to respond to what's in the world around me. Although sometimes I respond by writing books that are set in 1914. And it is a topic that I think a lot of writers would be drawn to, and partly possibly because we're getting the version of the stories we get. So the families aren't saying anything. These tabloid versions we know aren't accurate. So, in some ways, there is a moment where a novelist can step in and say, maybe if I piece together enough different things, I could come up with a narrative where right now there isn't one. But I don't know that there's a huge spate of them. And I think people are also often quite wary. Certainly, I think within Britain, there's often a wariness of taking on very contemporary politics in a novel, which is why I love what Ali Smith is doing now. She's writing sort of 4 novels, one a year, which is going to be set in the year she's writing it, which is wonderful, because I think in some ways possibly the Western novel, actually I can't speak for France, I don't know French, contemporary French literature, but the English language novel, I think very often has sort of moved into the space where it says, we must wait 70 years or 100 years after an event before we can write about it, which is not, of course, the Pakistani way of responding. And now you've got all these Pakistanis writing in the English language, so perhaps that's or Indians or Libyans or whatever. So maybe that's changing the idea of what happens within a novel. I'll be really interested to know what's going to happen with American fiction, because American writers, are they going to have to really deep down engage? And not to say that none of them have been doing it, but, I suspect you'll see sort of a deep level of engagement with the political moment in a way that possibly you haven't had since Vietnam with the American novel. I may be wrong, but I suspect.
Any more questions? Oh, yeah, just a lady there.
You said that in sort of terms of surveillance, that growing up under military dictatorship made you, there's things that sort of you find resonance in sort of modern Britain, but could you elaborate a bit more on that? And also the question of judgment, whether you think Britain's becoming kind of more judgmental rather than enabling, and if that's, listening to you just now, if that's one of the topics you were exploring.
So surveillance, one, the disquieting thing about this novel was, as I was writing it, I was getting very nervous about my internet search history. You know, I mean, to the point that I would sit there with two halves of my brain, and one half would say, you are being silly and ridiculous and paranoid and shut up, and the other half was saying, don't click on that. And I started doing things like I would, go and look at 2 websites that were related to all this nasty stuff, and then I'd look at 3 websites related to celebrity, just so anyone look and say, oh, she's okay, actually, that's fine. It was an issue, and actually, there was a separate part, which is there's a lot of stuff out there around Islamic State that I absolutely don't want to look at. I don't want that in my head. So there was that, but there was the other. I was very, very aware of how many of these sites I was clicking on and what that might look if what makes a red flag go up. And I've just become British. I'm Muslim. I'm also Pakistani citizen, and I would sit there constructing defenses in my head for what I'm going to say when the intelligence services come knocking on my door, which is, I'm a novelist. I've appeared on the BBC, I like cricket, all kinds of things. The Great British Bake. I wasn't watching the Great British Bake Off at that point, and then I got worried maybe I should be, That Great British Bake Off question actually comes because I was reading up about, various British Muslims who'd been interrogated at Heathrow for no apparent reason. And one of them said that he was asked all these questions on Britishness. And then the interrogator said to him, do you watch Dad's Army? And he said no, and he said that really counted against him, that there was this TV show that he hadn't watched. But it's that. So I mean, so the internet stuff I was very aware of, but it's actually something that's been growing for a while, and it's not even about state surveillance. I remember several years ago I was at Heathrow sitting in the departure lounge, and I was talking to my sister on the phone. And I was speaking mainly in English, but at some point I switched to Urdu, and then I got very, very self-conscious and it was just after some terrorist incident. Actually, no, it wasn't. There hadn't been a terrorist incident. It was after an incident after 2 men speaking Arabic had been thrown off a plane because the other passengers were nervous. It was the day or 2 after that. And halfway through a sentence in Urdu to my sister, I thought, I better switch back to English so as not to make people nervous. So that kind of thing, just that level of awareness in the air that by virtue of your religious background and the place you're from, this sense that you need to, what might you look like to someone who has no idea who you are.
Which can only work, I guess, in a sort of a vicious circle of alienation as well. Like if that has an impact on people's behaviour, then they'll feel more and more
Having
separate.
said that, I have writer friends who are not Muslim who say, we'd be really nervous about MI5 looking at our internet history if we were looking at that kind of stuff too. So we're all being surveyed and worried about it. There was, PEN America did a survey about 3 years ago where they asked their members, who are all writers, about the effects of surveillance, and there was something shocking, like some very large percent of writers said they had considered researching a topic in order to write about it and then decided not to because they thought it might be, surveillance might not like them researching the stuff.
It would be fascinating. I mean, it's difficult to study, but just the impact that's having on the literature that's being written as well. I think we've got time for one more.
That gentleman's had his hand up for a while.
We'll have 2 more questions. We'll begin with this gentleman and then this lady here.
It's a sequel. In Sunjeev Sahuta's Ours Are the Street, I mean, there's only a lopsided story about the radicalized youth. So I wanted to ask you how you would relate to that. And I have also a question about, I don't know if we have time, your interest in borders. Initially in some of your books there were geographical or historical borders, and they seem to be closing in personal borders and family borders. So you spoke about vulnerability, so if you in that context of borders closing in.
Well, I've always been interested in borders. I mean, it's the 70th anniversary of partition. My family in 1947, all both sides of the family moved over from what was what is now India to what is now Pakistan, and at the time they really thought that there's a new state, but there'll be no problem with us coming and going. And I grew up sort of 2 generations down, but my grandmother would still write every week to her sister who was in India. But my mother used to tell the story, which really stuck with me, that the first time my mother saw her mother cry was when my grandmother found out she was refused a visa to go to India to see her dying mother. And I remember as a very young child hearing this, and you just think, what nonsense is this? Sort of at 8, this is just total nonsense. But also what you realize is that it is, I suppose as a result, I've always understood borders through a lens of family heartbreak. And that's something that, and they are closing in, and they're pressing in. Even if you are in one state, these borders seem to be pressing in more upon you. Sanjeev Sahota, I think people should read his novel and mine, is my response to that. Yeah.
Okay, we'll finish. This young lady here had a question. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for this. So I don't know if it's a comment or question. Let's see how this plays out. But I was just thinking about...
What do you think at the end of it? And it'll be a question.
So I was just thinking about the representation of sort of 2 cities that you've put also in this novel, but also in your previous novels. And especially for me, growing up in Karachi, cartography was one of the ones that, was the thing that I consumed and felt like I related to. So, I guess it's maybe turning out to be a question, I guess, in my head, is that when you start writing a novel, I'm sure, like you mentioned Pakistan and a bit of Karachi and Taxila and stuff. And so obviously there's a part of you that's, of course, that you were there. And so when you start writing a novel, how does the process play out of you being in another country and a place you've claimed as a new home or anything? But then also Karachi, also the city that you juxtapose to London is, and when Anika is there, it's Karachi is harsh, it's solitary, it's all those things that you showed it to be. So how does the creative process play out for you? Is there a conscious decision or it just comes through you?
Well, it was really interesting in this one to write Karachi because, as you said, my earliest novels, the first 4 were all set in Karachi, really within 2 miles of where I grew up mostly. And then the 5th, Burnt Shadows, has a section, one of 4 sections is half in Karachi. And then A God in Every Stone has 2 pages in Karachi. And really there's no need. I basically forced an English woman to fall sick on a ship in order to keep her in Karachi for a couple of days so that she couldn't get a train right from the port up to Peshawar, which is where she was going. There was no need, really, but it was so I could write, really, if we're going to be honest, I suspect I did it so I could write 2 pages of Karachi in this book. And this one has probably 7 or 8 pages. But this was interesting because I had to write Karachi as it appears to someone who... It was almost like I was about to use a really horrible expression, turn my eyes inside out. That's a horrible sounding phrase. I'm so sorry. But I mean that I had to look at this city that I've known my whole life, but I had to see it through the eyes of someone who's never been there before, and who is coming there for the worst reasons and is going to just see the worst of it in some way. And so to her, it is hostile and alien and full of sadness. And I had to, it was in, as a writer, I've written cities I don't know. Sections of this novel are set in Raqqa, where I've never been. But to write the city that you really know, but write it as someone who doesn't know it, was actually great fun and very strange to do. But I sort of, but yes, it got there in there. It was like, one day I'm going to set a novel on Mars and I'll still find a way to have 1 paragraph in Karachi.
Well, we'll look forward to your next book in that case. That is all we've got time for, at least for the formal event part of it. As always, we'll be serving wine. Please do stick around. We have stacks and stacks of Kamila's books, Home Fire, of course, but also her backlist, which are available at the till, and I'm sure Kamila would be happy to sign them for you. As I say, do stick around, have a glass of wine, continue the conversation, and please just one more time give it up for Kamila Shamsie.